My husband said it was just a matter of convenience and safety, that with him being away so often now between the site visits and investor rounds, it made no sense for me to be driving all over the city alone when I had the option of staying comfortable and focused. And besides, it was only until he came back for good in a few months when the new office opened. So he arranged for someone to take me wherever I needed without asking for my input. Just handed me the name and schedule as if it were no more important than setting up a delivery. And I didn't argue because I didn't really see a reason to, because honestly, the idea of not having to park or find the car keys under a pile of receipts again sounded like a relief. His name was Logan. His name was 25 according to the email my husband forwarded from the agency. Quiet and polite and apparently vetted within an inch of his life by the insurance firm that oversaw corporate travel contracts. And from the first second I saw him standing by the car, I could tell he was one of those men who never needed to say much because his stillness already said everything. Someone who wouldn't ask unnecessary questions or crack awkward jokes. Someone whose clothes were pressed without a wrinkle, and whose expression gave away nothing except discipline and quiet observation. And that morning, as I stepped out onto the front stoop in low heels with my phone in one hand and my oversized bag in the other, I wasn't thinking of anything but whether I'd left my keys inside. It wasn't icy, but the stone steps still held that early morning panicked, just firm and certain like he'd done this before or seen it coming 5 seconds earlier. I caught my breath out of instinct but didn't say anything, because neither did he. And when I turned slightly in his hold, he looked straight at me without flinching and said one word in that same calm voice I would later come to recognize as his only register. Careful. And then he let go. Not like he had been burned or embarrassed, but like he had decided his job was complete and moved his hand back the same way a surgeon might set down a tool, cleanly and without second thought. I walked the rest of the way to the car in silence, aware of my own posture in a way that hadn't occurred to me before that moment, and when I sat down and pulled the door shut, I realized the radio was already playing quietly in the background. Not loud enough to be obvious, but clear enough to recognize the station I usually played while folding laundry or organizing papers in the living room, the same soft mix of 70s guitar and low-tempo jazz that I never told anyone I liked. But here it was, as if he had taken a guess and gotten it right without even looking. He didn't speak the entire ride, didn't ask me where we were going or whether I was comfortable or if I wanted the AC adjusted, didn't try to make polite conversation or fill the air with anything, just drove with steady hands at 10 and 2 and signaled early and braked smoothly. And it was that kind of silence that isn't empty, but full of restraint, full of quiet observation, full of choices made not to cross a line that hadn't yet been drawn but still existed. When we pulled up to the curb outside the florist, he got out without a word, walked around to open my door before I'd even reached for the handle, and when I said thank you, his eyes met mine again. Not long, not lingering, but not dismissive either, like he was absorbing the moment as data and saving it somewhere private. And I noticed that again on the way home when he waited until I'd fully closed the front door before backing down the driveway, his car idling just a moment longer than necessary, as if listening for something unspoken. That evening, when my husband called to check in, the conversation was short and forgettable until he asked casually in the middle of an unrelated sentence, "Logan normal? Not one of those overly chatty types or anything weird?" And I said no, just quiet, not weird at all. Which was true on the surface because there was nothing visibly off or uncomfortable about him. But it wasn't just silence that made him stand out. It was the kind of focus that left you feeling like your presence had been measured and noted, like he wasn't just waiting for instructions, but paying attention to what wasn't said. By the third drive, I knew his rhythm well enough not to be surprised when he stepped out again before I had unbuckled, but this time, instead of just opening the door, he extended his hand without a word, palm open and steady, not forced or ceremonial, but expected, somehow. And without thinking, I placed my own in his like it had already been agreed upon before the moment even arrived, and my fingers fit too easily around his, not romantically or meaningfully, but without pause, like habit pretending to be formality. There was nothing said, no gesture that crossed any line, but the truth settled quietly in the space between our hands, an understanding too subtle to name and too early to fear. And when I let go, I felt it not just in the space he'd filled, but in the absence that followed. After that ride, something small but undeniable began to shift, and I couldn't explain it out loud without sounding foolish, because there were no words exchanged between us and no gestures anyone else would notice. But the air started feeling heavier in the car each time I stepped inside, as if the silence had gained texture and weight, and suddenly every moment I spent in that passenger seat felt too still, too precise, like the shape of my presence was being outlined in chalk, and every motion of his hand on the wheel was more than just habit. It was calibration, like he was adjusting his actions to match mine without needing to ask how or why. I began watching him through the corner of my eye, obviously not enough to be caught, but enough to note the way his posture never changed, no matter how long we drove or how much traffic pressed around us. He held his body the same way from start to finish, spine-straight shoulders, calm hands placed perfectly at the wheel with no tapping, no fiddling, no glances at his phone, and never once did he reach for the radio again after that first day, as if he already understood what filled the space best. After each trip, he would follow the same routine with an accuracy I came to expect, but could never quite ignore. He would pull into the driveway, slow and centered, park exactly within the border of the pavement without brushing the curb, then remain seated for a moment, his hand resting on the gear shift, his eyes briefly checking each mirror in turn, then the navigation screen even if it wasn't active, as if there was something left to confirm, and only after that sequence would he turn his head just enough to see me stepping toward the door and only then start the engine again and drive away, never with a rush, always with the same even rhythm that made you wonder whether he felt time passing differently. It wasn't lost on me how often I found myself pausing before going inside just long enough to notice whether his taillights were still visible around the bend, how many times I caught myself standing at the kitchen window pretending to water the plants while really watching the quiet silver car ease down the street and vanish. And it wasn't infatuation or attraction. Not in the usual way. It was something else, more elusive, more quiet, more about awareness than desire, and it unnerved me just enough to make me more careful with my own thoughts. My husband never picked up on any of it because there was nothing concrete to pick up on. Nothing wrong with hiring a driver. Nothing wrong with letting someone else take over the wheel for a few weeks while he flew back and forth across the country. And when he asked again a few days later if Logan was still working out, I answered honestly because the answer hadn't changed. He was still quiet, still punctual, still polite, but what I didn't say was that I'd started to recognize the exact pattern of his footsteps on the stone outside and could tell without looking when it was him versus the Amazon guy or the neighbor's son walking their dog. It was on a Thursday morning that I noticed the car was parked closer than usual, and it wasn't dramatic or suspicious, just 2 feet, maybe 3, but enough that I paused on the steps and looked at it longer than I meant to, because Logan never parked unevenly, never adjusted his habits without cause. And I knew that, because I'd been watching, because we both had, whether we admitted it or not, and that small change said more than any words would have. I didn't mention it to my husband because there was nothing to report, nothing inappropriate, nothing visible, nothing that could be printed or replayed or judged. Just a car a few feet closer to the porch, a driver who waited 1 second longer than required before pulling away a hand that had met mine with quiet precision, and a moment at the bottom of the stairs when I had almost fallen and didn't, and a silence between us that had not been filled since. And still, each time Logan pulled up, I felt that pause in my chest, that anticipation I never acknowledged, that subtle awareness of something unsaid passing between us, like smoke, like static, like the brief sensation you get before a storm when the air thickens and your skin reacts before your brain knows why. And I hated that I noticed, and I hated even more that I didn't stop noticing. But I kept walking to the car every time on schedule, and every time the door opened before I reached for it, and every time I said thank you in the same calm voice, and every time his eyes met mine just long enough to make it feel like something had happened, even though it hadn't, and every time I told myself this was just a temporary arrangement, nothing more, just a man doing his job and a woman appreciating the ease of it. Only sometimes when I stood in the doorway before stepping outside, I would catch myself listening not for traffic, not for birds, not for the neighbor's lawnmower, but for the exact sound of that engine rounding the corner like clockwork. And the moment I heard it, I would breathe differently, not better, not worse, just differently, like my body had adjusted itself without asking, and I knew then that something was shifting even if I hadn't yet given it permission. It started with a question so simple it barely registered, the kind of question that shouldn't matter, that most people would forget the second it was asked, but something in the way he phrased it stayed with me longer than I expected, because it wasn't casual or indifferent. It was calculated in the most polite way possible. A question that sounded like a formality, but landed like a step closer than necessary. And when Logan turned toward me that morning, as I closed my bag and reached for the car door, he asked, not too loud and not too soft, "Do you prefer the windows open or the air conditioning on?" And I paused for a moment, surprised not by the question, but by how carefully it was delivered. And I said without thinking, "It doesn't matter." And he held my gaze for half a second before nodding once and saying, "I'll remember." And from that day forward, he never asked again, just adjusted the temperature according to that one answer, as if he'd filed it away and wouldn't need confirmation again. I didn't notice at first how often he anticipated my movements, how quickly he began stepping out of the vehicle, not only to open my door but to stand waiting before I even approached. How he positioned himself just far enough to be proper, but close enough to intercept anything that might go wrong, as if my daily errands required guarding from an invisible force neither of us could name. And it wasn't until the third week that I realized he had stopped treating the job like a schedule and had begun treating it like a pattern, something to learn and then master without asking permission. One afternoon, something shifted more visibly, and I wasn't the only one who noticed, because my husband came home earlier than planned, unannounced, and as I stepped outside in flats and a light sweater expecting the familiar hum of the engine at the curb, I instead saw Logan not in the car but by the front gate, standing still with his hands clasped loosely in front of him like someone waiting for a decision to be made. And just as I opened my mouth to ask if something was wrong, I heard the front Doctor open behind me and my husband's voice, curious, not yet suspicious, ask, "What are you doing out here?" And Logan didn't flinch or shift, just turned slightly and said, "I wanted to confirm the route before we leave so there's no delay." And my husband hesitated only a moment before nodding, but the way his eyes lingered a bit longer than necessary made it clear that the simplicity of the answer hadn't landed quite right. After that, Logan began adjusting more than just routes or temperatures. He started approaching the house more often, not just when dropping me off or picking me up, but even when there was no ride scheduled, like the time I left my umbrella in the back seat, a detail I'd forgotten entirely until I found him standing at the base of the porch steps, 2 hours later, holding it upright in his right hand, waiting silently, not ringing the bell or sending a text, just standing there with that same stillness that unnerved and intrigued me in equal measure. And only when I opened the door did he lift it toward me without a word and turn back toward the sidewalk without waiting for a thank you. The second time something nearly crossed the invisible line was in the hallway near the side entrance when I told him I wouldn't need a ride the next morning because the event had been rescheduled, and he'd stepped inside just far enough to hear me clearly without making me raise my voice. And as I said the words, I realized how close we were standing, not inappropriately close, but too close for strangers, too close for silence, too close for what we were pretending not to feel. And in that exact second, I heard the slow steps of my husband coming down the staircase, socks brushing against the hardwood with that steady rhythm I'd known for years. And Logan didn't move, didn't clear his throat or adjust his position. He just turned his head slightly and looked at the floor. And my husband paused at the bottom step, eyes flicking between us for a breathless second before he turned without a word and climbed back upstairs. I told myself it didn't mean anything, that proximity wasn't intimacy, and silence wasn't complicity. But the next time Logan drove me to the grocery store and offered to grab a cart without waiting to be asked, and later reached for my wallet to hold it while I fumbled through my purse for the membership card, I couldn't help but feel the way his fingers curled around it like it was something delicate or important. And when I finally looked up, expecting him to return it immediately, I saw he was still holding it, watching my face, waiting, not demanding but not yielding either. And only when I looked directly into his eyes did he extend his hand toward me and let the leather touch my palm again. These weren't grand gestures, they weren't declarations or risks, but they built on each other like bricks stacked quietly when no one's looking. And by the time I noticed the wall, it was already waist-high and made of choices too small to name but too specific to ignore. And still I didn't tell anyone because there was nothing to report. No line crossed, no words exchanged that couldn't be denied, and I couldn't explain the weight of a whisper if no one else had heard it. The shift became impossible to ignore on a Tuesday afternoon, overcast but warm. One of those days when the weather can't decide whether it wants to be summer or fall, and the air presses against your skin with the weight of a question you haven't been asked yet. And we were returning from a stop at the post office when Logan parked not at the curb as usual, but slightly angled toward the walkway, just enough to make the exit feel more exposed. And when I unbuckled and reached for the door handle, he was already out, walking around. His steps so soundless, they startled me when the door opened beside me, and instead of stepping aside after holding it, he remained there just a second too long, as if waiting for something I hadn't offered yet, and still said nothing as I stepped past him. Later that day, as I sorted groceries in the kitchen and moved automatically through the repetition of domestic order, I couldn't help noticing the quiet outside, not the peaceful kind, but the kind that means someone is waiting. And when I peeked through the side window by the pantry, I saw the silver car still there, engine off, Logan inside but not moving, hands resting calmly on the wheel, his profile visible but unreadable, and he didn't leave until I moved away from the window, as if my watching had become part of the rhythm he waited for. It was only days later that I finally heard something different, not in volume, but in meaning, when he leaned in slightly at the end of a short ride, his voice low enough to be private, but steady enough to land exactly where it needed to, and said, "You always say don't, but you never say go." And the words settled like a stone dropped into still water, and I froze, because I hadn't realized how much weight silence could carry until it cracked open, and I answered, trying to stay neutral. "I don't want to explain what you meant." And he looked at me, not smiling, not smug, just certain, and said, "But you understood." And I didn't reply, because I had. There was no follow-up, no escalation, just that one moment left floating between us like a thread. Neither of us pulled, but both of us saw. And from then on, every interaction carried its echo, and I stopped pretending it wasn't real, even though I kept telling myself it wasn't. Dangerous, not yet. That evening, I stood behind the curtain in the living room, the kind of fabric that filters light just enough to soften edges without blocking anything real. And I watched as his car pulled away from the curb at the slowest speed I'd ever seen him use. Not like someone driving off from work, but like someone waiting to be called back, like someone testing whether stillness could speak louder than a question. And I didn't step outside, didn't wave, didn't acknowledge it. But I stood behind the curtain and watched until the taillights disappeared, and only then did I exhale. The problem wasn't what had happened, because nothing had, not officially, not publicly, not concretely, but the problem was how aware I had become of each movement, each pause, each gesture that used to be invisible, and how now I couldn't enter or exit a room without calculating the distance between us or the direction of his eyes. Even in places that should have been neutral. Like the store, the weight of his presence never loosened, and when we moved down the aisles, he didn't crowd or hover, but matched my pace exactly, as if each step was chosen with a precision that couldn't be accidental. And when I stopped to check a label or compare items, he stood just close enough that I could sense the space he allowed me without needing to look, and I never asked him to move further away. At the checkout, when I fumbled in my purse for the right card and my fingers brushed receipts and keys and useless coupons, he stepped forward and reached without speaking, took my wallet smoothly, not like someone stealing time, but like someone assuming it, and I let him, because I was tired of searching, because I knew he would hold it without question. And when I found what I needed and looked up, he still hadn't handed it back, and we stood there in that moment that wasn't a transaction anymore. And when our eyes met, he gave it back, slowly, as if waiting for my fingers to touch his again. There were no conversations about boundaries because none had been defined, no confrontations because nothing had crossed into something nameable, and yet everything inside me felt increasingly unsettled, like a room with a door slightly ajar that no one remembers opening, and each time I told myself to step back, to reframe, to stop interpreting the quiet as anything but discipline, I found another moment that contradicted the lie I was trying to restore. And so I kept watching him leave, kept listening to the sound of his tires on the street like a clock marking a time that didn't belong to me, and each night I stood by the window longer, not because I expected anything to change, but because I already knew it had. The air felt thicker than it should have for a morning like that, warm but with a slow-moving breeze that didn't quite reach the skin, the kind of weather that made everything feel like it was happening half a second slower than it should. And the bags from the market were heavier than usual, not because of what I bought, but because I'd stopped noticing what I was picking up, distracted by how he watched me choose fruit without asking what it was for, by how he moved behind me, at just the right pace. Never too close to draw attention, but never so far that I stopped feeling it. And when we pulled into the driveway, I didn't reach for the door first. I waited, because I knew he would come around and open it like always. And I stepped out with a calm I didn't feel, because I had already noticed he wasn't looking away anymore. While unloading groceries, Logan and I stood very close together at the trunk. When he looked at me intensely, I recognized I should have stepped away but didn't, acknowledging that the dynamic between us had become inappropriate. He didn't smile or frown or adjust his posture. He just stepped forward slowly, enough to cross the invisible space we'd been pretending not to measure for weeks. And when I whispered, barely audible, "You're making a mistake right now," he didn't flinch or retreat or apologize. He said calmly and clearly, "You're not moving." And I realized then that I wasn't, that my feet hadn't shifted and my hand was still resting on the trunk and my body hadn't taken a single step backward, and I didn't say anything else because there was nothing left to explain that hadn't already happened in the way I was still standing there. He leaned in without hesitation, not fast or dramatic, but steady like someone who didn't need permission because he had already read the answer in everything I hadn't said, and his mouth met mine with a stillness that wasn't hesitant but deliberate, a single kiss that didn't ask for anything more but left no room for denial, and I felt it like a door being unlocked from the inside, not violently, just finally, and before I could think or name the feeling, I kissed him back, not out of confusion or heat, but with a quiet certainty that had been building like pressure, behind glass. And the moment passed without sound, without commentary, just the exchange of something we could no longer pretend wasn't real. I stepped back first, Not out of guilt or panic, but because I knew the timing had to be mine, and I looked at the ground because I couldn't bring myself to look at his face again so soon, and he didn't reach for me or ask for more. He just tilted his head slightly and said, "Same time tomorrow?" And I nodded once, not trusting my voice to stay even, and replied, "Yes," before turning toward the house and walking inside without waiting to see if he watched me go. The second I closed the door behind me, my phone buzzed with my husband's name lighting up the screen, and I answered because I had to, because anything else would have drawn attention, and his voice came through the speaker casual and upbeat, asking if I was free Friday night for a dinner with his team, one of those group events he always believed would help us reconnect with his colleagues and make me feel more involved. And I said yes automatically, the way you say yes to anything that keeps questions away. But while I spoke, I wasn't thinking about centerpieces or table settings or conversations over wine. I was thinking about the next time I would be in the car alone again. That night, after the house went quiet and the windows glowed with the soft haze of television light and dishes settled in the sink, my phone buzzed again, a different notification, just one line that read, "Thank you for today." No questions, and I didn't reply because I didn't know what I could say without opening a flood I wasn't ready to name. But I didn't delete it either, didn't archive or mute or swipe it away. I left it there on the screen like a stone. I wasn't ready to move, and every time I picked up my phone after that, I saw it waiting, like a quiet reminder of something that had already begun. The next morning, I hesitated before walking out to the car, not out of fear, but out of awareness, because now the air between us wasn't silent anymore. It was heavy with memory, and when I sat in the passenger seat, I didn't look over right away. I focused on the stitching in the dashboard and the way the air vents hummed softly. But when I glanced into the rearview mirror, I saw him standing by the hood again, not getting in, just waiting, as if I needed to acknowledge something first before we could drive away. And instead of asking why or standing frozen, I opened the door and stepped out, walked up beside him, didn't say good morning or offer context. I just said one thing clearly, "Let's go," and turned back toward the car. The silence in the car that morning was different from every other time we'd ridden together, because now it wasn't just the absence of conversation, but the presence of everything that had been said without words. And when I closed the door and buckled my seatbelt, I didn't glance toward him, and he didn't ask where we were going because he already knew. And even though the map was programmed and the route was familiar, the air inside the vehicle felt like it was carrying weight, not the suffocating kind, but the kind that makes your chest rise differently. Like your body is adjusting on its own before your thoughts catch up, and neither of us touched the radio because noise would have felt like a lie. The street rolled under us like always. The intersections passed in their usual order, the neighborhoods unchanged, but something about the way he moved his hand from the wheel to the turn signal, and the way my fingers curled into my lap made it feel like each stoplight was a question neither of us wanted to answer. And still, every time the car slowed down, I found myself turning toward him. Not sharply, not urgently, just slowly, instinctively, as if my eyes were checking to see if the memory of yesterday had changed anything in the shape of his mouth or the rhythm of his breath. And each time I looked, he didn't look back, not right away, but I could feel that he noticed, because his hands would still and his jaw would shift slightly like someone swallowing a thought they weren't ready to speak aloud. There was no rush in our movements that day, no tension or awkwardness, but there was a precision in the way. We occupied space like we were both measuring the temperature of something invisible. And at the grocery store, I stepped out of the car first without waiting for him to open the door like before, not because I wanted to take distance, but because I wanted to see what he would do if I changed the pattern. And he followed a few seconds later, neither slower nor faster than usual. And when we walked side by side through the parking lot, he didn't brush against me or reach for the cart. But when I stopped at the entrance and turned my head, he was already looking, and still. We said nothing. Inside the store, the mundane act of choosing apples and checking expiration dates felt absurd, like I was playing a part in a life that hadn't fully reset. And I found myself looking at my own hands more than the items on the shelf, distracted by the fact that they didn't shake or tremble or betray anything, even though my thoughts were spinning. And when we reached the checkout lane, he didn't stand behind me this time, but beside me, close enough that I could feel the edge of his shoulder without touching it. And when I fumbled with my card, he didn't move to take it like before. He just waited, still and observant, until I met his eyes on my own. Driving home was quieter than usual, if that was even possible, because now the silence wasn't just between us but around us, surrounding the car like a shell, and I looked out the window and watched the houses pass, all of them oblivious to the fact that a storm had already happened and passed in the space of one kiss, and still I didn't regret it. Not because I wanted it to happen again, but because pretending it hadn't happened would have felt like a betrayal of something that had been building long before either of us admitted it. When we pulled into the driveway, he didn't turn off the engine immediately, and I didn't reach for the door. I just sat there for a moment, letting the tension rise and settle like dust in afternoon light. and then I opened the handle and stepped out, not quickly, not slowly, just moving because I had to. And when I reached the front door, I didn't look back, but I felt him still there, watching. Not in a way that demanded anything, but in a way that acknowledged everything. Inside, I moved through the motions of normalcy, keys in the bowl, shoes by the door, grocery bags unpacked one by one. And all the while, I could feel the echo of that moment in the driveway pressing against my ribs like a second heartbeat. And when I finally sat down at the table and looked at my phone, I didn't expect a message. And yet I wasn't surprised when there wasn't one, because some things don't need repetition to be remembered. That night, while my husband sat on a video call with his team in the next room and the house was filled with the distant hum of voices that no longer needed me to listen, I stood by the window with the curtain barely shifted and watched the spot where Logan had parked earlier, now empty. And even though I knew he wouldn't return tonight, I still stayed there long enough for the glass to grow warm against my hand. And in the silence, I heard every word we hadn't said. The next morning came with the same weight, the same rhythm, and when the car arrived on time and the engine idled exactly where it always did, I walked out without hesitation. And when I stepped into the passenger seat, I didn't glance at him immediately, but I felt the air between us tighten slightly, like a held breath. And this time, when we pulled away from the house, I looked at him not out of habit, but out of confirmation. And he met my eyes with the same quiet certainty that had started all of this. And neither of us smiled, and neither of us spoke, but both of us knew this wasn't the end. The drive started like any other, with the same quiet between us that had long since shifted from awkward to deliberate, the kind of silence that didn't need filling because it was already full of memory and tension, and the slow burn pull of everything we hadn't undone yet. And when he asked if I wanted to come with him to check on some construction materials near the lake, I didn't hesitate or ask questions because the lie was thin enough to pass and thick enough to protect us from what we both knew was no longer just about errands or routine. So I said yes and climbed into the car like I had every other time, pretending that the distance from the house to the passenger door still meant something. The road to the lake was long and empty in the middle, lined with pine and low clouds that gave the impression of privacy without requiring us to speak it out loud, and I kept my hands folded in my lap and my gaze angled slightly out the window, not because I didn't want to look at him, but because I knew if I did, something would change again, and I wasn't ready for change. Not yet. Not unless I was the one who asked for it, and we didn't speak at all until the turnoff appeared, sharp and sudden, unmarked by signs or direction, and he took it without warning but not without intention, because I knew the moment the tires left the main road that this wasn't about wood planks or finish samples. He pulled into the gravel lot near the edge of the lake and turned off the engine, and the quiet that followed wasn't peaceful or restful but waiting, and I stayed in the passenger seat with both hands still in my lap and my shoulders too still. Not because I was afraid, but because I wanted to see what he would do if I didn't move first. And after a long pause that stretched without snapping, he opened his door, stepped out, walked around the front of the car, and opened the driver's side again, sliding in beside me with the same careful control he always carried, the kind that made you feel like the moment was heavier than the space it occupied. He didn't look at me immediately, just stared ahead at the water through the windshield, his voice low and steady when he finally said, "You knew I was going to signal when I turned." And I nodded before he could say anything more, not quickly, not defensively, just enough to make it clear I understood, and I said, "Yes, I knew." And we sat there for a second that felt like a decision, and then I added, "And I didn't say anything, because I hadn't." And we both knew that silence had been consent long before words ever tried to interrupt. At the lake, Logan touched my hand and then my cheek gently. When he pointed out that I wasn't asking him to stop, I remained silent because he was right. I wasn't asking him to stop the inappropriate contact. The sky had started to dim by the time we drove back, and the air had changed in that subtle way it does right before night starts swallowing the outlines of familiar things, and neither of us said anything the entire drive home, not because there was nothing to say, but because saying it would have taken away the clarity of what we'd already allowed. And when we pulled into the driveway, I reached for the door before he could move and stepped out without looking back. Not because I was trying to reclaim control, but because I knew he would be standing there behind me by the time I reached the porch, and he was still silent, watching, not demanding anything, but waiting like someone who had already received the answer he came for. And when the door opened and my husband stood there in a polo shirt and tired eyes, he asked casually, "You were gone a while." And I said, "The store was closed," without shifting my voice or glance. And even though the lie was small and smooth, he didn't believe it, not really. Because I saw the pause in his eyes, the flicker of something he wasn't ready to confront, and still he said nothing more, just stepped aside to let me in, and Logan turned and walked away before the moment stretched too far. The next morning, the house felt quieter than usual. Not because anyone had said anything, but because everything unspoken had started filling the corners. And when Logan sent a message asking if he could take the day off to slow things down and stay away from the schedule, my husband read it aloud from his phone and said, "That's fine, tell him to take the time." And I said nothing because I already knew the time wasn't about rest or recovery or errands. It was about what came next. And what came next was me walking out into the backyard 2 hours later, knowing exactly where he would be and not pretending otherwise, and finding him near the garden wall in that same posture I had started associating with inevitability. And before I could speak, he said, "You don't wait for things to happen anymore, you create the moment." And I didn't deny it because there was nothing left to pretend, not to him, not to myself. The air felt unusually still that morning, thick with the weight of what was already decided but not yet acted on, and when I woke up before the alarm and stood barefoot by the window, I didn't check the time or reach for my phone. I just stared at the empty spot in the driveway where his car would be soon, and listened for the sound of my husband packing, moving from one room to the next, in a rhythm that had become familiar over the years. One built on logistics and responsibility, and the illusion that routine could protect us from everything that tried to slide in between. And when he kissed me on the cheek and said, "Back by Thursday," I nodded and smiled and returned the kiss like I always had, except this time I didn't follow him out to the car or wave from the porch. I stayed inside and waited until I heard the engine fade into the distance before turning around and walking straight to the closet. I dressed without thinking too much, pulled on jeans and a sweater, and slipped my phone into my bag without checking. For messages because I already knew there wouldn't be any. Not from him. Not this time. And when I stepped outside, the sky was overcast and the wind pushed faintly against my collar like it wanted to warn me but couldn't find the words. And I didn't pause at the top step or look around to see if anyone was watching. I walked straight to the driveway and saw him standing by the hood of the car, already waiting, arms crossed loosely, head slightly tilted like someone who had arrived before the invitation was fully spoken. He didn't ask if I was ready, didn't say good morning or make a joke to diffuse the quiet. He just looked at me in that way he had always looked, the kind of look that asks nothing and says everything. And when I reached the edge of the car and stopped without opening the door, he said, "You knew I would come." And I nodded, not with hesitation, but with clarity. And I said, "I wanted you to, because I had." And neither of us smiled, and neither of us moved right away. We just stood there at the center of a choice that was no longer about what would happen, but when it would. Logan and I stood very close together, with him gently stroking my knuckle with his thumb. We both recognized this as a point of no return, but allowed the intimate contact to continue, because I was no longer resisting. We didn't kiss this time, and it wasn't restraint or fear, it was understanding, because some moments aren't meant to be expanded, they're meant to be acknowledged. And this one was about knowing how close we already were to a line we wouldn't be able to erase once it was crossed again. And even though everything in my body leaned forward, even though my breath had already shortened and my heartbeat had already changed tempo, I didn't move that last inch, and neither did he, because we knew that one more movement would collapse the quiet we'd kept intact for too long. He let go of my hand slowly, like someone finishing a sentence without punctuation, and I stepped back without turning around, walked to the passenger side, and opened the door without waiting for him to follow. And when I sat down, I didn't look over. I stared straight ahead and listened to the sound of his footsteps moving toward the driver's seat. And when he slid in beside me, we didn't say a word. We just sat there, still together, breathing in sync without agreement. The drive that followed was empty of noise, not because we had nothing to say, but because saying anything would have felt like a choice. And we weren't choosing yet. We were holding, preserving, stretching out the space before the next collapse. And every time the car slowed for a turn or a stop sign, I found myself turning toward him again, like I had the week before, like I would the week after. And each time I looked, I found him doing the same, not as a reflex, but as a mirror. And we never spoke during those looks. We just held them like secrets between two people who had already stopped pretending to be distant. By the time we returned to the neighborhood, the sun had shifted behind the clouds, and the shadows on the pavement had stretched longer than the time we'd been gone. And when he pulled into the driveway, I waited until the engine stopped before unbuckling, and we stepped out at the same time, not in rhythm, but in agreement. And when I turned to thank him, out of habit, out of something closer to grace, he only nodded once, as if he knew I wasn't thanking him for the ride. We didn't make plans that day, didn't confirm tomorrow or the next, didn't say when or how or even if. But the silence between us said something far more binding than words, because it carried the truth neither of us wanted to admit, but both of us had stopped running from. And as I closed the front door behind me and leaned my back against it for a second longer than I should have, I realized I hadn't just created the moment. I had stepped fully into it, and now it belonged to both of us, whether we said so or not. The morning didn't begin differently, not by sound or light or weather, and yet everything inside me registered it as separate, as marked, as if the air itself had changed its weight, and the steps I took down the hallway were heavier in a way I couldn't blame on sleep. And when I opened the front door, the brightness outside hit my eyes a second too late, not because the sun was stronger, but because I had stopped looking at anything the same since the last time I closed that door behind me. And when I stepped off the last stair and walked toward the car, I already knew he was there before I saw him. Already sensed the stillness that only ever came when he arrived before I did, and this time he wasn't by the driver's side or waiting at the open door. He was at the trunk, standing with both hands resting lightly on the edge like he'd been holding it there for balance or for a reason he hadn't named yet. He turned his head as I approached but didn't speak right away, and for a brief moment we just stood there, both of us silent but not uncertain. And then his voice, lower than usual and edged with something I hadn't heard before, not weakness or caution but strain held tight beneath control, reached across the space between us as he said, "Your lips are trembling." And I knew they were. I could feel the pulse in them from the breath I'd held too long, but I didn't admit it, not directly. I only tilted my head slightly and answered, "Your voice is different," because it was, and I needed him to know I wasn't the only one whose skin had thinned since yesterday. Logan kissed me deeply and deliberately, and I immediately leaned into the kiss and placed my hand on his shoulder. This was clearly about desire that had been building for a long time rather than a moment of confusion. The sound that came next didn't belong in that space, didn't fit the shape of what we were inside, and yet it cut through everything as sharp as it had to, because the slam of the front door cracked open a moment we hadn't yet let go of, and I turned my head too late to stop what was already done. Because my husband was standing at the edge of the steps, just beyond the railing, still and unspeaking, with one hand half raised as if he'd been about to pull something from his pocket, or scratch his head, or reach for something he'd forgotten. He wasn't carrying, and for a moment, nothing happened. No words, no gestures, no visible anger, just the awful density of a man seeing exactly what he'd stopped believing was possible. I stepped back, only once. Only just enough to separate the space between us into something deniable, though we both knew there was no way to unmake what had already been seen, and my husband didn't follow the movement or raise his voice or take a step closer. He only stood there with his mouth set and his eyes locked on mine and said, not coldly, not angrily, but with a flat finality I hadn't prepared for, "Neither of you flinched, not once." And the silence that followed was so much heavier than shouting would have been, so much sharper than questions or accusations or pleading, because it meant that whatever had just broken had not surprised him. Not really. Logan didn't say anything right away, didn't move or try to explain or interrupt, but when he finally lifted his eyes from the ground to look directly at the man he'd just lost the right to be invisible to, he didn't carry fear or regret or defiance, only a steady quiet like someone acknowledging what had already been decided for them. And my husband didn't return the look, didn't even glance toward him. He kept his eyes on me like I was the only person still standing in the frame, and he said, "You're finished." Not like a threat or a punishment, just a notification, a signal, a closing line to a sentence that had been waiting for an ending, and then he added, "We'll sort the rest this evening," before turning away and walking back inside without slamming the door behind him. I stood there without speaking, not out of guilt or fear or confusion, but because the air around me had shifted again, and I couldn't yet tell whether it had dropped or lifted, and Logan, still unmoving, finally said, "He didn't yell." And I shook my head slowly, still staring at the spot where the steps met the gravel, and I answered, "That's worse." Because it was. Because yelling would have given me a shape to respond to, a wall to push back against, a sound to call final. But this was quiet judgment, the kind that had already been weighed and measured before the door even opened. Nothing else was said, not then, not as I walked back toward the house with my arms stiff and my hands too empty, not as I stepped over the threshold and left the door open behind me like it might decide for itself whether to close, and for the rest of the day I moved through the house like a guest in a place I no longer recognized, waiting not for punishment or forgiveness, but for a decision I already knew had been made. Evening came without announcement, the sky dimming, not in a burst of color but in a slow, sullen fade that matched the weight in my chest. And I didn't turn on the lights right away, because something about sitting in a dark room made the edges feel softer, like reality could be delayed if shadows were allowed to stretch across the floor untouched, and I sat at the kitchen table for what felt like hours, though the clock barely moved, my hands resting on either side of the laptop as if I were preparing to write something, when in truth I couldn't even open the lid, until the sound of an incoming message pulled my attention forward like a hook. The sender was exactly who I expected, and the subject line was blank, just a single line in the body of the message written with a precision I hadn't expected but should have. "You'll get the house." I'm not going back to a place where I stood like furniture, and there were no accusations, no pleads, no questions. Just that one sentence, perfectly placed like the final nail in a box that was already sealed, and I read it without blinking, not once. And after I finished, I closed the laptop slowly, not out of drama, but because it felt wrong to let it snap shut like the moment was finished when it had only just begun to settle in my bones. There was no part of me that wanted to call him, no impulse to justify or defend or soften what had been exposed so completely, because there was no space for pretending we had taken a wrong turn or misunderstood each other, no room to rewind what had already fractured in real time under the gray light of morning and the silence of a man who didn't even need to ask the obvious question, because he already had the answer in the way neither of us reacted when the door opened. My phone buzzed again, softer this time, later than I thought it would, and I knew before I touched the screen that it would be him, the other half of the weight I now carried, the man who had never pushed too far but had never truly stepped back either, and the message was short. Need help with anything? And I stared at it for longer than I meant to, not because I didn't know the answer, but because seeing it asked in writing made it more real than I was ready to admit, and I typed slowly with both thumbs, not pausing to overthink, just pressing. The words that had already formed inside me, "No, I'll do it alone," and hit send without waiting for the second thoughts to catch up. There was no reply, not immediately, and that silence felt heavier than it ever had inside the car, or beside the lake, or near the back of the house where we once stood too still for too long, because now it wasn't a choice, it was an echo, and I placed the phone face down on the table like I was done with it, though the weight of it still pulled at the corner of my vision as if it were trying to speak without lighting up again. Upstairs, the hallway smelled faintly of his cologne and something warmer, like cedar in old books, a scent that had once meant familiarity but now only reminded me of absence, and I opened the bedroom door expecting to feel something final, but all I saw was order, the bed made, the closet cracked open, a shirt left folded on the arm of a chair like a placeholder. And the longer I stood there, the more I understood that he had already removed the version of himself that used to live in this space, leaving only the outline of what had been decided long before we kissed near the stairs. That night, I didn't sleep in the bedroom, not because I couldn't bear it, but because it felt dishonest, like stepping into a room that still belonged to two people when only one remained. And instead, I lay on the couch in the den with the lights off and the curtains open just enough to let the moonlight carve thin silver lines across the floor, and I watched them shift slowly as the hours passed, each shadow growing longer and softer, like the proof of time undoing itself 1 inch at a time. I didn't cry. Not because I wasn't sad, but because there was no space left for tears in a body already filled with consequence. And every part of me that wanted to reach for comfort also knew it couldn't come from him. Not anymore. Not tonight. Not in the form of a message or a visit or the brush of his hand against mine like it had meant nothing when it had already meant too much. The next morning I stood at the window again with a cup of coffee that had gone cold in my hand before I'd even taken a sip, and the driveway was empty in the same way it had always been before I ever met Logan, but now it felt more pronounced, like the absence was no longer circumstantial but intentional, and even though I knew he wouldn't pull up at the usual time, and opened the door like nothing had happened, part of me still listened for the sound out of habit, as if memory could override truth just long enough to give me something soft to lean on. But the sound didn't come, and I didn't move, and the day unfolded without event or interruption, and still I stood there by the window long after the coffee was undrinkable, holding the weight of everything I'd chosen in the hollow space, between knowing and admitting, between stepping forward and being caught, between standing still and walking into the kind of silence you don't come back from. It didn't happen loudly or suddenly, or with the kind of dramatic punctuation I might have expected if I had ever allowed myself to imagine how this would end, because Logan didn't send a message or leave a note or offer a conversation to explain the absence that began quietly on a Wednesday morning when the car didn't pull into the driveway and the sound of the engine didn't hum up the hill like it always did. And at first I thought maybe something small had interrupted the pattern, a detour, a delay, a wrong turn, but the hours passed and the driveway stayed empty, and by the time the sky began to shift its color toward evening, I already knew without needing confirmation that he wasn't coming back. I called the office once, not because I wanted to hear the answer, but because pretending to wonder felt more bearable than accepting, and the woman on the line said calmly and without pause that Logan had resigned 2 days prior. No forwarding contact, no stated reason, just a final entry in the system, and a silent goodbye that landed in my ears like a locked door. And I said thank you and hung up before the sound of her voice could turn into something I'd carry with me longer than I should. There were no missed calls from him, no unread messages, no sign that the thing that had held so much weight only a week earlier had left even a shadow behind. And still, I found myself checking the street corner every morning through the curtain, staring not because I expected him, but because habit isn't broken by silence, it's broken by something louder, and he hadn't given me anything except emptiness to rearrange my thoughts around. My husband didn't say much either, at least not to me, because what followed wasn't a confrontation or a reckoning, but a series of emails exchanged between lawyers with dry language and short deadlines. And when the paperwork arrived by courier, it was so impersonal and polished that I almost laughed at the way something so private could be packaged into something so efficient, and I signed it without delay. Not because I had come to peace with it, but because I didn't want to stretch the humiliation any longer than I had already worn it. The neighbors didn't knock on the door or pretend to offer support under the guise of curiosity, but their presence became sharper in its silence. The way eyes would linger a second too long while I watered the plants or collected the mail. The way two people would lower their voices when I passed the end of the aisle at the grocery store. Their glances darting sideways like children trying, not to be caught but wanting very much to be seen. And I never said anything because what was there to say to people who had already drawn their conclusions in whispers behind produce bins and checkout counters? After the third day of that, I stopped, parking in the driveway altogether, pulled the car into the garage, and shut the door before the engine even cooled. Not out of guilt or fear, but because I was tired of being watched through windows I hadn't asked to be part of. And when I wasn't driving, I began moving the furniture, again, dragging chairs from one side of the room to the other, pulling the couch away from the wall to vacuum underneath even when it wasn't dusty, shifting lamps and shelves, as if their placement had something to do with the emptiness that followed me from room to room. But no matter how many times I moved the coffee table, or opened the curtains wider, or scrubbed the floors until the tile burned the skin on my knees, the silence stayed the same, not aggressive or loud but constant, like a hum just beneath hearing that you can't turn off no matter how many lights you switch on or how loud you let the television play in the background. Then the email from my daughter arrived without warning, just her name in the corner of the screen and a subject line that didn't ask anything, and when I opened it, I read the sentence 3 times before closing the lid of the laptop like I was trapping something inside. I don't believe it. With the driver? Seriously? And that was all she wrote. No greeting, no signature, just that single expression of disbelief that carried more weight than she probably intended, and I didn't answer. Not because I didn't have words, but because I didn't have any she'd be willing to hear. No one else called, no one texted, no unexpected knocks at the door from people pretending to need sugar or share news about a local fundraiser. Just the same street passing through its hours with the same quiet pace. And the house no longer felt like a home or a prison, but something in between. A space where movement still happened, but connection had long since evaporated. And sometimes, I caught myself talking aloud when I dropped a spoon or found a picture frame crooked, just to remind myself I had a voice. I began to walk outside alone more often, not far, not with purpose, just to move, to feel the difference between the stillness inside and the stillness out. And each time I locked the door behind me, I noticed how easily the key turned now, like even the house had grown used to being left alone. The lock barely resisted beneath my hand that afternoon, its smooth rotation a reminder of how often I had done this alone lately, how many times I had stepped outside without waiting for anyone or being met by anything except the flat air and the wide quiet of a neighborhood that had already moved on, and I held the keys a little too long after turning them, not because I was unsure of leaving, but because even the simplest gesture felt final now, as if every click of metal against metal marked another shift I could no longer undo, and I placed them in my coat pocket with the same motion I used to reserve for lipstick or a grocery list, slow and deliberate and meant to fill time I no longer had reason to rush. I stepped onto the porch and paused. Not because something had stopped me, but because nothing had. And that stillness struck me harder than it should have. The realization that I was no longer being waited on or watched or wondered about. That the rhythm of my days had settled into a pattern with no interruptions, no unexpected arrivals or questions, just the same soft echo of footsteps against concrete that belonged only to me now. And when I sat down on the top step, it wasn't because I was tired. It was because I needed to feel the shape of the street from the outside. Needed to sit not as a woman interrupted, but as a woman who had finally reached the edge of something and found no resistance there. The street stretched out in front of me with the same symmetry it always had, the same trees casting long shadows. Across the pavement, the same wind pushing dust toward the gutter in slow, lazy spirals. But today it looked wider, emptier, more like a photograph than a place people actually lived in. And I stared at it with the kind of focus that only comes when you've run out of distractions. When you've scrubbed every dish and folded every blanket and opened and closed the fridge 4 times without realizing you were never hungry to begin with. No one drove by, no bikes rolled past, no children screamed from yards behind fences. And for the first time in weeks, I didn't flinch at the sound of a car engine, because there wasn't one, not even in the distance. And I realized slowly that the part of me that had once strained toward every sound hoping for a familiar rhythm had gone quiet too, had stopped lifting its head at every passing shadow, had stopped rehearsing what I'd say if anyone asked what happened, because no one had. The silence no longer felt temporary. It had settled into the siding of the house, the gaps in the floorboards, the unread books stacked on the living room table, and I started to understand that what had once felt like waiting had turned into living, not loudly or bravely or with resolve, but simply, with small repetitions and half-filled moments and the slow erasure of expectations I hadn't realized were still hanging on until they were gone. There were no new messages, no letters on the mat, no voicemails blinking with missed chances, or second thoughts, just the hollow ring of nothing, clean and whole and uninterrupted. And even when I walked past the mirror in the hallway, I noticed that I'd stopped checking whether I looked composed, because there was no longer anyone to read my face and find the cracks, no one to notice whether my hair was brushed or my eyes were red from sleep that didn't settle the way it used to. In the evenings, I left the lights off longer, walked through the house in the kind of shadow that made edges softer and walls feel further apart, and sometimes I caught myself standing by the window without realizing how I got there, watching the empty road stretch into its usual vanishing point, and I would stay there not because I expected movement, but because I had forgotten what else to do with that part of the day. The car stayed in the garage now, quiet and unused, its tires cooling into stillness like the rest of the house. And each time I opened the door to that narrow space and saw it waiting, I felt both comfort and distance, like it belonged to a version of me that had places to be, and people to meet and plans to carry out, and now it simply held the memory of motion without the need to move. And I sometimes placed my hand on the hood like I was checking for life. On the last day, I remember clearly, I sat on the porch again in the same seat, with the same jacket, holding the same warm cup that had gone cold before I could taste it. And I stared at that street like I had stared at 1,000 others before it. Train station platforms, hotel lobbies, parking lots after goodbyes. But this one was different. This one didn't promise anything at all. And that lack of promise felt more honest than anything I had clung to in the weeks before. There were no cars, not even one in the distance, and the silence didn't rush to fill the gap because it had already been there all along, and I didn't cry or speak or move. I just sat there with my fingers wrapped around a mug I didn't need, and a key in my pocket that didn't open anything new. And as the wind shifted and the leaves stirred faintly at the edge of the sidewalk, I knew that this stillness, this wait, this perfect absence, was mine now, and it would follow me into every next thing I chose, not loudly, not bitterly, just quietly, like a shadow that had forgotten how to lift.